The sun bled into the horizon off Monterey Bay, streaking the sky with molten amber and bruised purple. Calm waters mirrored the fading light, casting a glow that bathed the weathered hull of the second wind. At the helm, Frank Wilson, leathery-skinned and hollow-eyed, guided the boat back to harbor, his mind adrift in quiet routine. Then he saw it, a shape, out there nearly 3 miles offshore, struggling against the waves. At first glance, it made no sense. But then it moved, limbs flailing, desperate. "Good Lord Almighty," Frank muttered, easing the throttle forward. "What the hell's a dog doing out here?" A German shepherd, soaked and half drowned, was fighting to stay afloat. Frank pulled alongside, listening to the pitiful whimpers, raw, exhausted, almost human. With effort, he hoisted the trembling creature aboard. It collapsed in a heap, heaving wet breaths onto the deck. But what caught Frank off guard wasn't just the dog's survival. It was the look in its eyes, intelligent, urgent, not just fear. Not just relief, purpose. "What is it, boy?" Frank asked softly, draping an old wool blanket around the animal. His flannel shirt clung cold and wet to his skin. But he barely noticed. After 43 years on these waters, Frank had seen his share of strangeness, whales breaching close enough to soak the deck, jellyfish glowing like stars in midnight currents, but never a dog, alone and driven, miles from shore. "Easy now," he murmured. 3 years had passed since Martha died. These days, Frank rarely spoke more than a handful of words. Just him, the seagulls, and the endless conversation of the sea. The dog's breathing steadied, but its eyes never stopped watching him. Frank examined the collar, high-quality leather, worn by salt and time. He thumbed the metal tag, Rex. The rest, what looked like a phone number, was unreadable. "Rex, huh?" he said aloud. The ears twitched. "Well, Rex ... You're about the luckiest dog I've ever seen." He stopped short. Another hour out here and the dog wouldn't have made it. The sun had vanished. Only a dying glow lined the distant horizon. Frank glanced toward the harbor. Home was waiting, frozen dinners and gunsmoke reruns in his empty bluff cottage. The sensible choice would be to head in, call animal control in the morning. But something held him. Rex had pulled himself upright again and now stood rigid at the bow, staring toward deeper waters. He turned back to Frank with an almost human impatience. A low whine escaped. Then a sharp bark. "What is it, boy?" Frank asked, feeling foolish. But he couldn't deny the dog's intensity. Rex barked again, insistent, then pawed at the gunwale, facing the open sea. Frank checked his watch. Checked the fuel gauge. He had enough. "This is crazy," he said. "Martha would say I've lost my marbles." But Frank had long learned to trust his instincts at sea, and every one of them was screaming. This isn't just a lost dog. He turned the key. The engine rumbled to life. "Okay, Rex, you want me to follow you? Then let's see where this goes." The dog's tail gave one slow wag. His eyes seemed to say, "Hurry." 2 months earlier, Emily Winters stood on the deck of the Oceanic Explorer, her blonde ponytail flicked by the salt wind. At 35, she was already one of the West Coast's leading marine biologists. Beside her, Rex trotted confidently along the railing. "I still don't get why the dog needs to be here," James Parker said as he joined her. He was tall, sharp-featured, with salt and pepper hair that aged him in a good way. He'd been her research partner for 3 years. "This isn't standard protocol." "Neither is Rex," Emily replied, smiling as the dog paused to sniff the air. Muscles rippled beneath his black and tan coat. 3 tours in Afghanistan. Shrapnel injury. After he retired, the Navy retrained him for marine research. James raised an eyebrow. "He detects chemical shifts in the water faster than our instruments." "And," she added, crouching to scratch behind Rex's ears, "he saved my life twice. James grinned. War hero. Research assistant. Smoke detector. Don't forget LoyalCompanion, she said. After my divorce, he got me through a lot, she didn't elaborate. And James didn't press. Her ex-husband, Mark, a rising star surgeon, had resented her career. The final straw had been the custody battle over Rex. She'd only won because a neighbor testified to seeing Mark kick the dog. The thermal readings are spiking, James said, checking his tablet. Up 17% since yesterday. Emily frowned. Could be magma movement beneath the ridge, or normal fluctuations, James countered. That's why we're here, data, not drama. But Rex was alert, now rigid, ears forward. A low growl rumbled in his chest. What is it, boy? Emily asked. She'd learned to trust that growl. Probably a sea lion, James muttered, but Emily's gaze drifted westward, where the sky was darkening fast, clouds spiraling unnaturally. The air pressure dropped suddenly, making her ears pop. That's not normal, she whispered. By the time they reached the bridge, the first wind gusts had hit. Captain Brooks, a 30-year sea veteran, didn't hesitate. Secure all equipment, he barked. All hands below deck. But our data, Emily protested. No research is worth lives, the captain snapped. This system's moving too fast. I've never seen anything like it. Within minutes, the Oceanic Explorer was tossed like driftwood in 30-foot swells. Emily huddled in her cabin, arms around Rex, who stayed impossibly calm. Then came the crack, low and deep, the sound no sailor wants to hear. A hull breach. Emergency lights bathed everything in red. The captain's voice crackled. All hands prepared to abandon ship. Water surged through the corridors. Emily grabbed her pack and Rex's life vest, strapping it to his chest. They fought their way to the deck, now tilting dangerously. James appeared, bleeding and soaked. Here are our data, he said, shoving a waterproof case into her hands. She stuffed it into her bag. A massive wave crashed over the deck, sweeping crew into the sea. The ship was listing hard. The life rafts are gone. Someone shouted. Emily looked to Rex, eyes locked on hers with unwavering trust. We swim, she said calmly, checking his vest. Stay with me? Another wave hit. Cold swallowed her. She surfaced, gasping, searching the chaos, and spotted Rex swimming toward her. Lightning flashed. The Oceanic Explorer was nearly vertical now, its bow clawing at the sky before vanishing into the Black Sea. Debris. Screams. Darkness. Rex swam toward her. Always toward her. Section of what looked like the ship's mess hall table, and swam toward it, Rex at her side. With tremendous effort, Shep pulled herself onto the makeshift raft. Rex tried to climb up too, but the wood shifted dangerously under his weight. Stay in the water, Rex, she commanded. Hold on to the edge. For hours they drifted, the storm gradually subsiding as mysteriously as it had appeared. By dawn, the sea had calmed to gentle swells, but the situation remained dire. No other survivors were visible. Emily's emergency pack contained a water pouch, energy bars, a small first aid kit, a flashlight, and a whistle. Enough to keep her alive for perhaps 2 days. And somewhere in that pack was the data that could warn coastal communities if her suspicions about the thermal activity were correct. Emily's scientific mind calculated their odds clinically. They were miles from shore, off their planned course due to the storm. The emergency locator beacon on the ship would have activated, but search patterns would focus on their original location. The current was pulling them further from shipping lanes. Rex couldn't stay in the water indefinitely, even with his life. Vest. As the sun rose higher, bringing punishing heat, Emily made the hardest decision of her life. She unzipped her pack and retrieved the emergency GPS locator she always carried. A small device with limited battery life, but powerful enough to be detected by search and rescue if they were in the right area. "Rex," she said, her voice cracking, as she secured the device to his collar. "You need to find help." The German Shepherd looked at her with those intelligent eyes that seemed to understand everything. "I know it's far," Emily continued, fighting back tears. "But you're strong and you're smart. Find land, find people." She pointed west where the California coast lay beyond the horizon. "Go get help, Rex. Go." Rex hesitated, whining softly, clearly reluctant. To leave her. "It's okay," she said, stroking his wet fur. "I'll be right here, I promise. Go get help. Boy, Dot, it's our only chance." With one last look that seemed to contain a solemnpromise, Rex turned and began swimming steadily westward, his powerful legs driving him through the water with determined grace. Emily watched until he was just a small dot on the vast ocean, then finally allowed herself to cry. "Come back, Tom," she whispered. "Please come back with help." Frank guided his boat deeper into the darkening ocean, following the German Shepherds, cues with a mixture of curiosity and concern. Rex stood at Thebo, his posture alert despite his obvious exhaustion, occasionally turning to ensure Frank was maintaining course before facing forward again with intense focus. "This is about the Dinza. Craziest thing I've done since I tried to outrun that nor'easter back in '86, Frank muttered, adjusting his cap. The rational part of his brain argued that he should turn back. Night fishing was one thing, but heading miles further offshore based on a dog's behavior was asking for trouble. Yet something in Rex's demeanor, the urgent intelligence in those amber eyes, compelled Hymenward. The last violet traces of dusk had vanished entirely, leaving only the encompassing darkness of the open ocean at night. Frank switched on his navigation lights and the powerful spotlight mounted on the cabin roof. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating patches of gentle swells that stretched endlessly before them. The night was unusually still. No wind, the water almost glassy, as if the ocean itself was holding its breath. "Not much further, boy," Frank said, checking his fuel gauge. "Another mile and we turn back, rescue mission or not." Rick suddenly tensed, ears forward, and let out a sharp bark that startled Frank. The dog's tail wagged once. Then he began pawing at the gunnel and whining with renewed urgency. "You see something?" Frank swung the spotlight in the direction Rex was indicating, sweeping the beam across Thedric water. At first, he saw nothing but empty ocean. Then, as he was about to give up, the light caught something. A faint reflection that didn't match the pattern of the waves. "Well, I'll be," Frank murmured, adjusting course toward the anomaly. As they drew closer, the spotlight revealed what appeared to be debris. Fragments of white fiberglass and wood floating in a loose cluster. "Looks like a shipwreck." Rex's barking intensified, the sound piercing the night stillness. The dog was practically dancing now, moving from one side of the boat to the other, his exhaustion seemingly forgotten in his excitement. Frank maneuvered carefully among the floating debris, mindful of his propeller. "Hello," he called out, more out of protocol than expectation. "Anyone out there?" The silence that followed seemed to mock him until it was broken by a faint sound that made the hairs on the back of Frank's neck stand up. "Help." The voice was so weak he almost thought he'd imagined it. Frank swung the spotlight frantically, heart pounding. "Where are you? Call out again. Here." The voice was slightly stronger this time, coming from beyond a large piece of what looked like a ship's table. Frank carefully guided his boat around the obstacle, and the spotlight beam fell upon a sight that would be forever etched in his memory. A woman, pale and clearly exhausted, clinging to a makeshift raft fashioned from what appeared to be part of a deck or bulkhead. Her blonde hair was plastered to her head, her lips had a bluish tinge, and her eyes squinted painfully against the sudden light. Rex gave a joyful bark that seemed to contain all the relief and triumph in the world. His tail wagging frantically, the woman's eyes widened in disbelief. "Rex," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Oh my God, Rex." Understanding dawned on Frank with the force of a physical blow. The dog hadn't been lost. He'd been on a mission. He'd swam miles through open ocean, not to save himself, but to find help for his owner. "Hang on, ma'am," Frank called, already moving to secure his boat. "I'm coming to get you." Bringing the woman aboard proved challenging. She was so weak she could barely hold on to the life ring Frank tossed her, and it took all his strength to pull her from the water. Rex paced anxiously on deck, whining until the woman was safely aboard, then immediately pressed his body against hers as Frank wrapped her in his emergency blankets. "Thank you," she managed, teeth chattering violently. "Can't believe Rex found someone." "Name's Frank Wilson," he said, helping her to the small sheltered area behind the wheelhouse. "Your dog is something else, ma'am." "Never seen anything like it." "Emily," Shu whispered. "Emily Winters. We were research vessel. Storm came so fast." "Save your strength," Frank advised, cranking the engine. "We need to get you to shore and medical attention. You're suffering from exposure." Emily clutched at his arm with surprising strength. "Wait," she gasped. "My pack. The data important." Frank spotted the pack still attached to the makeshift raft. With some maneuvering, he managed to hook it with his gaff and haul it aboard. Emily relaxed slightly when he handed it to her, her blue-tinged fingers clutching it to her chest. "Need to warn thermal activity, prediction metals." Her eyes were becoming unfocused, her words slurring. Frank recognized the signs of advanced hypothermia and knew they were running out of time. He radioed the Coast Guard immediately, reporting a shipwreck survivor in critical condition. "This is fishing vessel Second Wind, approximately 7 miles west of Monterey Bay. I've recovered a shipwreck survivor, female, suffering severe hypothermia. Need immediate medical assistance upon docking." The Coast Guard response was immediate. "Roger. That, Second Wind. We'll have emergency services standing by at Monterey Harbor East Dock." "What's our ETA?" Frank calculated quickly. "About 40 minutes at full throttle." "Copy that. Can you provide details on the vessel that went down?" Frank glanced at Emily, who was now slipping in and out of consciousness despite Rex's efforts to keep her awake by nuzzling and licking her face. "Research vessel is all I know. Survivor's name is Emily Winters. She's mentioned something about important data and thermal activity, but she's in bad shape." There was a pause on the other end. "Did you say Emily Winters from the Monterey Oceanographic Institute?" "Don't know about that, but the name's Emily Winters for sure." "Stand by, Second Wind." The radio went silent for nearly a minute before crackling back to life. "We're dispatching a high-speed intercept vessel to your coordinates. They'll have medical personnel aboard. Continue toward harbor. They'll meet you en route." Frank acknowledged and set course for Monterey Harbor at his boat's maximum speed, the engine protesting the strain. He made Emily as comfortable as possible, elevating her feet and continuing to add layers of blankets. Rex remained glued to her side, his body heat providing additional warmth. As they raced through the darkness, Emily briefly regained consciousness, her eyes finding Frank's face. Rex swam. "For help," she whispered. "I know," Frank said gently. "He found me. You're going to be all right." She shook her head weakly. "Not just me." The data thermal vent activity, potential tsunami trigger, her hand clutched at the waterproof pack. "Warn them." Wouldn't listen. Need proof. Frank felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. "A tsunami, you're saying? There's a tsunami coming?" Emily's eyes were clearer now. Urgent, unusual thermal activity. Underground fissure expanding rapidly. Our models show less than 24 hours. Before she could elaborate, light sappered on the horizon. The Coast Guard intercept vessel approaching at high speed. Within minutes, they wherry alongside and a medical team was transferring Emily to their boat. Rex refused to leave her side, growling at anyone who tried to separate them until Emily weakly patted his head and whispered something in his ear. A Coast Guard officer approached Frank. "Thank you for your assistance, sir. We'll take it from here." "Wait," Frank said, unable to shake Emily's urgent warning. "She mentioned something about a tsunami threat. Said there's less than 24 hours. She has data in her pack that proves it." The officer's expression remained professionally neutral. "We'll make sure her information gets to the right people, Mr. Wilson." As the Coast Guard vessel pulled away, Frank watched Rex standing protectively beside Emily's stretcher. His mission completed, but his vigilance fiendish. Something told Frank this wasn't over. Not for Emily, not for Rex, and somehow not for him either. He turned his boat toward Monterey Harbor, but instead of the relief he expected to feel, a nagging sense of unfinished business settled in his gut. 24 hours, a tsunami warning that someone hadn't taken seriously, and a dog who had swam miles through open ocean to save not just his owner, but perhaps countless others as well. "This ain't over by a long shot," Frank muttered to the empty night, as the lights of Monterey began to twinkle on the horizon. The fluorescent lights off Materi Peninsula Hospital cast harsh shadows across the small waiting room where Frank sat, his weathered hands fidgeting with the brim of his captain's hat. 3 hours had passed since they'd brought Emily Winters ashore. The Coast Guard medics working frantically to stabilize her as they rushed to the emergency room. Frank had followed in his truck, driven by an inexplicable sense of responsibility that he couldn't shake. A soft whine drew his attention to the large German shepherd sitting beside his chair. Rex had been reluctant to leave Emily's side, but hospital regulations were firm. It had taken a nurse with a soft spot for animals to bend the rules, allowing Rex to wait in the reception area rather than be taken to animal control. "She's going to be okay, boy," Frank said softly, reaching down to scratch behind Rex's ears. "Tough lady, your owner." The dog leaned into his touch, those intelligent amber eyes looking up at Frank with what seemed like gratitude. Still, the animal remained alert, head turning toward the double doors every time they swung open. Frank was about to check with the reception desk again when the door spun to reveal a tall man in a white coat, his expression professionally neutral as he scanned the waiting room. "Mr. Wilson," the doctor called. Frank stood immediately. "Rex." Rising beside him. "That's me. How is she?" The doctor approached, extending his hand. "I'm Dr. Lawrence. Dr. Winters is stable. She was suffering from severe hypothermia, dehydration, and exhaustion, but we've managed to bring her core temperature up. She's asking for you and her dog. She's conscious?" Frank asked, surprised, and remarkably lucid given what she's been through. The doctor's expression softened slightly. "She says, you saved her life." Frank shook his head. "All I did was steer the boat. This fell here." He gestured toward Rex. "He's the real hero. Swam miles through open ocean to find help." Dr. Lawrence glanced down at Rex with newfound respect. "Extraordinary. Well, she's insistent on seeing you both. Normally, we wouldn't allow animals," but he hesitated, then lowered his voice. "There are some government officials here who seem very interested in speaking with Dr. Winters. They've been rather forceful. Having you present might help keep things civil." A nod of concern tightened in Frank's stomach. "Government officials' room. 217, Dr. Lawrence said. Already turning away. 5 minutes only, please. She needs rest." Frank and Rex followed the signs to the second floor. Outside room 217, 2 men in dark suits stood conversing in low tones. They fell silent as Frank approached, their expressions professionally blank. "Excuse me," Frank said, keeping his tone polite despite the immediate dislike he felt for these men with their crisp suits and cold eyes. "I'm here to see Dr. Winters." Taller of the two men stepped forward. "And you are?" "Frank Wilson. I'm the one who found her." The men exchanged glances. "Mr. Wilson, I'm Agent Dawson with the Department of Homeland Security. We are conducting an interview with Dr. Winters regarding some claims she's made. Perhaps you could wait until we're finished." It wasn't really a question. But Frank had spent 40 years as his own boss on the open ocean and wasn't about to be intimidated by a suit. "Doctor said she's asking for me," he replied firmly. "And this here's her dog. Don't reckon she'd be too cooperative without seeing him first." Agent Dawson's jaw tightened, but before he could respond, the door opened and a nurse appeared. "Dr. Winters is recommended," she said, her tone making it clear where her priorities lay. "She's demanding to see someone named Frank and her dog. Doctor's orders are to keep her calm." Frank didn't wait for permission, brushing past the agents with Rex at his heels. Inside the room, Emily lay propped up against pillows, and foreline in her arm and color finally returning to her face. Her eyes lit up when she saw them. "Rex!" she exclaimed, voice still weak, but filled with emotion as the German Shepherd rushed to her bedside, placing his front paws carefully on the edge-off mattress to nuzzle her face. Pilled down her cheeks as she buried her fingers in his. "Fur, you brilliant, amazing boy." After a moment, she looked up at Frank, her eyes now serious despite the tears. "And you must be Frank. Thank you for trusting him. For saving me." Frank shifted uncomfortably under her gratitude. "Just doing what anyone would do." "Ma'am, Emily, please," she insisted. And no, not anyone would head miles offshore at sunset following a dog's directions. She glanced toward the door. "Guessing you've met my unwelcome visitors." Frank nodded. "Said they're from Homeland Security. Something about claims you've made." Emily's expression hardened. "They don't believe me. Or rather, they don't want to believe me." She lowered her voice. "Did they take my pack? The waterproof one? Coast Guard, is it?" "I think," Frank replied. "You mentioned something about a tsunami warning." "On the boat? That what this is about?" Emily gestured for him to come closer. "The research vessel I was on, the Oceanic Explorer. We were monitoring annual thermal activity along an underwater fault line. My data shows that pressure is building rapidly. The resulting seafloor displacement could generate a significant tsunami within the next 18 hours. Frank felt his blood run cold. "You're certain?" "As certain as science allows," she replied. "But without the complete data set from IPAC to run through the Institute's prediction models, the authorities won't issue an evacuation order, the economist's impact of a false alarm." She trailed off, frustration evident in her voice. The door opened and Agent Dawson entered, followed by his colleague and a third man in a rumpled suit who carried himself with academic authority. "Dr. Winters," Dawson began. "This is Dr. Richard Hargrove from the National Weather Service. He's reviewed your preliminary findings and has some concerns." Dr. Hargrove stepped forward, adjusting his glasses. "Dr. Winters, while your dedication is commendable, the data you've provided is simply insufficient to warrant the kind of response you're suggesting. The probability calculations, calculations were run on incomplete data," Emily interrupted, her voice stronger now. "The full data set is in my pack, including readings taken just before the storm hit that show exponential scenery of thermal activity." "Even if that's true," Hargrove continued smoothly, "the models for tsunami generation from thermal expansion are theoretical at best. Without seismic confirmation, there won't be significant seismic activity until it's too late," Emily insisted. The Thermal expansion is causing microfractures that won't register on your equipment until the critical point is reached. By then, we'll have minutes, not hours. Frank watched the exchange with growing unease. The academic argument was beyond his expertise, but he recognized the politics at play. Tourism season was at its peak along the California coast. An evacuation order would cost millions, and if nothing happened, careers would end. "Where is my pack?" Emily demanded. "I need access to a computer to run the complete data set through our models." Agent Dawson's expression remained impassive. "Your personal effects are being examined as part of our investigation into the sinking of the Oceanic Explorer." Emily's face palled. "Investigation. The storm capsized us." It formed suddenly with unusual intensity. "So, you've claimed?" Dawson replied. However, Captain Brooks filed a report just before the incident indicating concerns about unauthorized equipment modifications that may have compromised the vessel's stability. The accusation hung in the air, like a physical presence. Frank saw Emily's hands clench into fists, saw the flash of betrayal in her eyes. "That's absurd," she whispered. "Michael would never." "The captain's report specially mentioned your research partner, Dr. James Parker, making unauthorized adjustments to stabilize the equipment on the lower deck." Dawson continued relentlessly. Emily shook her head. James wouldn't unless she stopped, a new understanding dawning in her eyes. "Unless he was trying to discredit my findings." "Oh God, what do you mean?" Frank asked, stepping closer to the bed. Emily looked up at him, her expression grim. 3 days before we sailed, James and I argued about my preliminary findings. He said I was being alarmist that publishing such dramatic predictions could damage our funding prospects. He wanted to modify the data to show a more gradual progression. She turned back to the agents. "You need to understand James recently accepted a consulting position with Pacific Coastal Development. They're breaking ground on a $1 billion resort project in Carmel next month. An evacuation order, even a false alarm, would spook investors." Dr. Hargrove scoffed. "That's quite an accusation, Dr. Winters. Dr. Parker is a respected scientist with an impeccable reputation. Where is James now?" Emily demanded. Agent Dawson consulted his phone briefly. Dr. Parker was rescued by a passing vessel shortly after the Oceanic Explorer went down. He's currently at the Oceanographic Institute assisting with the investigation. "He has access to the Institute systems," Emily said urgently. "If he modifies the baseline data before I can run my new readings through the DDIM models." "Dr. Winters," Dawson interrupted, hissed condescending. "You've been through a traumatic experience. It's natural to seek explanations, even scapegoats, but making unfounded accusations against colleagues, Frank had heard enough." "Seems to me," he said, his quiet voice cutting through the tension, "that it wouldn't hurt to run the lady's data through these models she's talking about. Worst case, nothing happens and you all look thorough. Best case, you prevent a disaster." "It's not that simple, Mr. Wilson," Dr. Hargrove replied. "False tsunami warnings can cause panic, economic disruption, and real tsunamis can kill thousands." Frank finished flatly. "I've spent my life on these waters. Never seen a dog swim miles through open ocean to find help. Never seen a scientist fight this hard to be heard. Seems worth listening to." A tense silence fell over the room, broken only by the steady beep of Emily's heart monitor. Finally, Agent Dawson spoke. "Dr. Winters needs to rest. We'll continue this discussion tomorrow morning." As they turned to leave, Emily called out, "Check the data drives in my pack." The readings are Redham stamped. If James has altered the baseline at the Institute, the discrepancy will be obvious. The door closed behind them, leaving Emily, Frank, and Rex alone in the suddenly quiet room. Emily slumped back against the pillows, exhaustion evident in every line of her face. "They're not going to listen," she whispered. "Not in time." Frank studied her face, weighing his next words carefully. In his long life, he'd learned to trust this instincts about people even more than his instincts about the sea. And if everything in him said Emily Winters was telling the truth, "Then we'll have to make them listen," he said simply. Emily's eyes widened in surprise. "We?" Frank nodded, reaching down to scratch Rex behind the ears. "This old dog through with you," he said with a slight smile. "Reckon I might as well do the tea." Same. For the first time since he'd pulled her from the ocean, Emily Winters smiled. A tired, grateful smile fat-reached her eyes and made Frank suddenly very certain he was making the right choice. "I need to get to the Institute," she said, determination replacing despair in her voice. "I need me data drives and access to our systems." "You need rest first," Frank countered. "No use trying to save Feckost if you collapse in the process." Emily's expression softened. "You're right." A few hours sleep, and then she glanced at her watch, anxiety returning. "We have less than 18 hours before the critical threshold is reached, if the models are correct." "Get some sleep," Frank said, rising from his chair. "I'll be back at dawn. We'll figure this out." As he headed for the door, Rex remained by Emily's bedside, clearly unwilling to leave her again. Emily looked up at Frank, a question in her eyes. "Don't worry," Frank assured her. "All smoothing's over with the nurses. He's earned the right to stay." As Frank Wilson walked out of the hospital into the cool MTRA night, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years. A sense of purpose beyond the daily routine of survival that had defined his existence since Martha's death. Tomorrow would bring challenges couldn't yet imagine. But for the first time in a long time, Frank wasn't facing the future alone. And somehow that made all the difference. Thepper dawn light cast long shadows across Monterey Harbor as Frank guided his truck through the nearly empty parking lot. Sleep had evaded him after leaving the hospital, his mind too full of tsunami warnings and government agents with cold eyes. He'd spent the night on his boat instead, reviewing coastal evacuation maps and tide charts, preparing for what might come. As promised, he returned to the hospital at first light, a bag of clothes borrowed from his neighbor's daughter in hand. What he found was chaos. Nurses rushing through corridors, security guards stationed at entrances, and Emily Winters nowhere to be found in room 217. She checked herself out against medical advice. The charged nurse told him, disapproval clear in her voice. "Took the big dog of hers, too. Left about an hour ago?" Frank wasn't entirely surprised. Emily struck him as the type who wouldn't wait for permission when lives were at stake. But where would she go? The Institute seemed most likely she needed those computers to run her models. Frank turned to leave, then paused. Did she say anything before she left? Leave a message, maybe. The nursey hesitated, then sighed. Nothing official, but she did ask if I knew where the second wind was docked. She gave him a knowing look. "That's your boat, isn't it?" Frank nodded, gratitude and determination mingling as he hurried back to the harbor. Sure enough, as he approached the dock, he spotted a figure sitting on a bench near his slip. Emily with Rex lying at her feet. She wore hospital scrubs under a borrowed jacket that hung loose on her still too thin frame. Her blonde hair was pulled back in asty ponytail, dark circles under her eyes betraying her exhaustion despite the determined set of her jaw. "Figured you'd come here," she said as he approached. "Hope you don't mind." "Been expecting you," Frank replied, noting how she still leaned on Rex for support as she stood. "Though I also figured you'd be smart now to stay in the hospital at least until daylight." A ghost of a smile crossed her face. "Never been accused of patience. Besides, time is running out." "I know." Frank gestured toward his truck. You're wanting to get to the Institute, I reckon." Emily nodded, but hesitation flicked across her features. "They'll be watching it. Homeland Security. Probably James, too. My keycard might not even work anymore." "Then we need Applin," Frank said simply. "But first, breakfast. Can't save the coast on an empty stomach." 20 minutes later, they sat in a corner booth of the whaling station, a dockside diner that had been serving fishermen since before Frank was born. The owner, Maggie, had known Frank for decades and didn't bat an eye at Rex settling under their table, merely bringing an extra bowl of water without being asked. Over plates of eggs and coffee strong enough to float a spoon.